All right, Safety One Source listeners, today we're taking a deep dive into OSHA standard 1926.651, excavation safety. As you know, this standard is crucial for anyone in construction or really anyone who cares about workplace safety. And today we're going straight to the source, the OSHA standard itself. No interpretations, no summaries, just the real deal.
Yeah, absolutely. This standard is all about keeping workers safe during excavations. Really, it's a lifesaver.
Okay, so I know excavations can be dangerous. We all know that, right? But I'm really curious, what are some of the less obvious hazards that 1926.651 addresses?
That's a great question. You see, it's not just the obvious things like cave-ins. This standard, it goes into everything, from protecting workers from, things falling on them to the dangers of, bad air, hazardous atmospheres. They can be super dangerous, and you might not even realize it.
Okay, so it's a much bigger deal than just, putting up some supports in a trench.
Mm-hmm.
So where do we even begin with this whole deep dive into 1926.651?
Well, right from the start, 1926.651A, it deals with those hazards above ground. What OSHA calls surface encumbrances, loose rocks, equipment, maybe even trees, anything that could be a danger to the workers around the excavation.
Oh, so it's like you got to make the whole area safe, not just the hole in the ground.
Exactly. The standard is super clear. These hazards, they need to be removed or, supported the right way. No shortcuts.
That makes sense. Okay, so we've secured the surface. What about those hidden dangers, the ones we can't see, the ones that are, underground?
You mean underground installations. That's 1926.651B. Hitting a gas line or some electrical cable, that's a disaster waiting to happen. And OSHA, they lay out a specific process for handling them.
Okay, walk me through it.
First, you got to find those utilities before you even think about digging. Contact those utility companies, check all the records, use detection equipment. It's like a treasure hunt, but with, much higher stakes.
But let's be honest, those utility companies, they don't always respond very quickly, do they? What if you're up against a deadline and you're still waiting for that all clear?
Yeah, that's a good point. OSHA gives them 24 hours to respond to those location requests. Unless, of course, your state or local laws say otherwise. But after that 24 hours, you can proceed cautiously, but you've got to use that detection equipment. No digging blind.
Safety first, right. Okay, so we've got a clear zone. We've avoided those underground surprises. Now, what about actually getting in and out of these excavations? I'm sure OSHA has something to say about that.
Absolutely. Safe access and egress, that's 1926.651C. And for any excavation that needs structural ramps, OSHA gets very specific.
Okay, this is where it gets interesting. Give me the details.
These ramps, you can't just throw them together. A competent person has to design them. They got to be built with the right materials and built the right way, too.
Yeah.
Oh, and they need cleats or some kind of slip-resistant surface to, prevent slips and falls.
So no more makeshift dirt ramps.
Nope. Safety first. And when we're talking trenches deeper than 4 feet, it gets even stricter. You need a way out, stairs, ladders, ramps, and nobody should have to travel more than 25 feet to get out.
Right. Makes sense, especially in an emergency. Okay, so OSHA is all about high-vis clothing. Does that come into play with excavation?
Oh, you better believe it. If there's traffic, 1926.651D says those bright orange vests, they're mandatory. Can't be too careful.
Safety first, fashion second. Okay, now what about falling loads? It seems obvious, but I bet OSHA has some rules about that too.
Yeah, you got it. 1926.651E, that's all about falling loads. First rule, and this is super important, no worker should ever be under a load that's being handled by equipment. No exceptions.
Well, that seems pretty straightforward, but I guess it needs to be said.
Absolutely. And OSHA also says stay clear of vehicles when they're loading and unloading. Nobody wants to be in the way of a spill or worse, materials falling down on them.
Definitely not. But what about those operating the equipment? Are they allowed to stay in their vehicles while this is happening?
Well, there's an exception for the operators, but only if the vehicle has the right protection. Like a reinforced cab that can handle something falling on it. Otherwise, everybody needs to clear out.
Okay, so safety precautions for both the workers on the ground and the ones up in the machines.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what about those situations where, where the operator's view is blocked, like maybe there's a pile of dirt or something in the way? What does OSHA say about that?
That's where 1926.651F comes in. Warning systems for mobile equipment near excavations. If you can't see, you need other ways to prevent accidents.
So what are we talking about here? What kind of warning systems?
Well, think about barricades, hand signals, mechanical signals, even stop logs. And it's always a good idea to to grade the area away from the excavation, just as an extra precaution.
Smart thinking. Okay, we've talked about surface hazards, underground issues, falling objects, but I know there are some dangers that might not be so obvious, you know?
You mean hazardous atmospheres? That's one of the most serious risks with excavations.
Yeah, exactly. What does 1926.651 say about protecting workers from those invisible dangers?
That's covered in 1926.651G. And this is really important. We're talking about air that doesn't have enough oxygen, less than 19.5%, or if there's, harmful stuff in the air.
Oh, wow. That sounds like a recipe for disaster. What does OSHA recommend for dealing with something like that?
Testing. You got to test the air before anyone goes into an excavation deeper than 4 feet, especially in places like landfills or near areas where hazardous materials are stored.
It's like checking the weather, but instead of rain or shine, you're checking if you can even breathe.
Exactly. And if the air is bad, you got to take precautions. Ventilation, respiratory protection, the whole 9 yards. You just can't mess around when it comes to breathable air.
Yeah, no kidding. Are there any other dangers that OSHA highlights when it comes to, these hazardous atmospheres?
Flammability, that's a big one. You got to make sure those workers aren't exposed to flammable gas concentrations that are too high, over 20% of the lower flammable limit. OSHA is very specific about that.
So basically, don't turn the excavation into a giant bomb.
Exactly. And, if you're using controls to manage those hazardous atmospheres, you got to keep testing, make sure that air stays safe.
Continuous testing. It's like, checking your smoke detectors, right? Better safe than sorry. Now, what if you've tested the air and it is hazardous? What happens then?
That's where 1926.651G2 comes in. You got to have emergency rescue equipment ready to go, breathing apparatus, safety harness in line, basket stretcher, everything.
So you're preparing for the worst, even if you hope it never happens.
Exactly. And that equipment can't just sit there. Somebody's going to be there to monitor it while it's in use, to help out if needed.
It's like a lifeguard, but for bad air instead of, water.
That's a great way to put it. And if someone's entering a confined space like a bell-bottom pier hole, you got to take even more precautions.
Oh, like what? What makes those situations so different?
Well, think about it. Someone's down in that hole and something happens. They need a way to get out fast. So they got to wear a harness and a lifeline that's totally separate from any lines that are used for handling materials, just in case. And just like with the standby rescue equipment, someone's got to be watching that lifeline the whole time.
Okay, so we've covered the hazardous air. Now, what about water hazards? A flooded excavation isn't very useful.
Nope, not at all. That's why we have 1926.651 a town dealing with, water in those excavations.
Okay, so what are the key takeaways from that section? How does OSHA handle, water in excavations?
Well, the standard is clear. If there's water in there or if it's building up, you got to take precautions. Special support systems, water removal, maybe even using a safety harness and lifeline, whatever it takes to keep those workers safe.
So you got to adapt, use the right tools for the job. What about keeping water from getting in there in the first place? Does OSHA have any recommendations for, preventative measures?
Absolutely. They recommend things like ditches or dikes to redirect the surface water away from the excavation. Super important when it's raining a lot and there's, a higher risk of flooding.
That's proactive. Okay, so we've talked about air hazards, water hazards, but what about those structures around the excavation? Digging a big hole next to a building, I could see that causing some problems.
Yeah, for sure. That's what 1926.651I is all about. You start digging, and you can mess up the integrity of those buildings, walls, anything nearby. It's like dominoes, one wrong move, and everything could come crashing down.
So what does OSHA say you should do to protect those structures and make sure everything stays safe?
Support systems, those are key. Shoring, bracing, underpinning, whatever it takes to keep things, stable. And there are some really specific rules when it comes to digging below a foundation or a retaining wall.
Okay, give me the rundown on those rules.
Well, you can't just go digging under a foundation, just because. There have to be specific conditions met. Maybe you need to use underpinning, or maybe the excavation's in solid rock, something stable. Or a professional engineer has to approve it.
So no digging under your neighbor's house without permission. Now, what about things like sidewalks and pavements? Do those need special attention too?
Of course. You can't just, undermine those and hope for the best. You got to support them, protect them, or find another way to keep them from collapsing.
Support, protect, got it. Okay, we've talked about hazards above ground, below ground, water, nearby structures. What else could go wrong?
Well, there's always loose rock and soil. That's
Yeah.
1926.651J. Workers need protection from that stuff falling on them, just like any other falling object.
So no landslides allowed. What does OSHA say about dealing with that?
Well, they say you can use scaling, put up protective barricades, or any other method that'll do the same job. The idea is to keep that loose stuff from, falling on somebody.
Right, like rock climbing, but with more rules. Now, we've talked about protecting workers from things falling out of the excavation, but we got to protect them from things falling into it too, right?
Exactly. Tools, materials, anything that could fall in and hurt those workers down there.
It's like baby-proofing an excavation site. What are some of the ways to prevent that from happening?
OSHA gives a few options. You can keep materials at least 2 feet away from the edge, or you can use retaining devices to keep them in place, or you can do both. The goal is to create a buffer zone, prevent those accidents.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of potential hazards, but how do we make sure we catch those issues before they become big problems? I'm guessing regular inspections are pretty important here.
You're absolutely right. 1926.651K is all about inspections. They're a huge part of excavation safety.
Okay, pop quiz time. Who's responsible for those inspections?
The competent person. They're the ones who need to be inspecting the excavation, the area around it, and any protective systems every single day.
Right, the competent person.
Yeah.
So what are they looking for during those inspections?
Anything that looks like trouble, potential cave-ins, signs that the protective systems aren't working right, hazardous atmospheres, you name it. It's like a daily checkup for the excavation site, making sure everything's okay.
So it's not just a quick glance, it's a thorough look. And how often do these inspections need to happen?
It's a daily requirement, but it's not just once a day. They have to happen before work starts, throughout the day if needed, and especially after anything that could increase hazards. A rainstorm, a change in the soil, even construction nearby.
So the competent person has to be able to adapt. That's a lot of responsibility. What happens if they find a hazard?
Safety comes first. If there's a hazard, they got to get those workers out of the danger zone until it's safe again. No excuses.
Okay, so we're inspecting, we're protecting, we're being proactive. Anything else we need to be thinking about when it comes to moving around the excavation site?
Well, 1926.651 talks about walkways. If you've got people or equipment that need to cross over an excavation that's 6 feet or more above a lower level, you got to have walkways with guardrails.
It's like a little bridge over the excavation abyss. And I'm guessing OSHA has some rules for those guardrails, right?
Of course. They have to meet all the specs in section 1926.502B. We can talk more about that later, but for now, just know that OSHA's got you covered when it comes to safe walkways.
Wow, we really covered a lot today, but I know we've only just scratched the surface of, excavation safety.
You're right, there's always more to learn, especially when it comes to, actually putting these rules into practice. Welcome back to our deep dive.
All right, we're back, ready to dig into more of 1926.651. Last time, we covered a lot, but I know there's still so much to uncover. So where do we go from here?
You're right. We've just scratched the surface. Now it's time to get to the heart of excavation safety, soil classification and protective systems. That's where 1926.652 comes in.
Okay, so this is like the foundation, right, for safe excavation.
Exactly. You got to understand those soil types and pick the right protective system. That's key to preventing cave-ins, and those can be really bad news, Serious injuries, even fatalities.
No kidding. Okay, so break it down for me. What kind of soil classifications are we talking about? Is it just like dirt or rock, or is there more to it than that?
Oh, it's definitely more complicated than that. OSHA, they have 4 main soil types: stable rock, type A, type B, and type C. Each one, it's got its own characteristics, and what's really important, its own level of stability.
Okay, so it's like a rock, paper, scissors of soil, but with much higher stakes. So stable rock, why is it so stable?
Well, it's rock. Stable rock's the most stable. It's solid, doesn't break apart easily. It's like the bedrock of excavation safety, literally.
So pretty safe to dig in, I'd imagine.
Well, yeah, relatively. But even with rock, you can't just assume everything's fine. There can be cracks or weaknesses. You got to check those out before you start digging.
Always got to be on the lookout. Okay, so what about type A soil? Where does that fit in?
Type A, it's cohesive. That means it sticks together pretty well, and it's strong, under pressure. Clay, silty clay, that kind of thing. Less stable than rock, but still pretty sturdy.
Okay, so type A is like the reliable friend. You can count on it.
Exactly. Now, type B, that gets a little trickier. Still cohesive, but Not as strong as type A. It's more likely to crack or, slump, so you got to be more careful.
Okay, so type B is a bit more unpredictable. What are some examples, just so I can picture it?
Think like angular gravel, silt, or even soils that have a mix of different sized particles. It's not as simple as just clay or rock. You got to pay attention.
Gotcha. Type B, watch out for that one. Now, what about type C? I have a feeling this is where it gets, really dangerous.
You got it. Type C, that's the least stable. It's granular, which means it's, made up of loose particles like sand or gravel. Doesn't stick together well at all.
So quicksand, but without, the sinking.
Yeah, pretty much. This stuff, it's the most likely to cave in, so you need the strongest protections to keep people safe.
Makes sense. Okay, so we know the different types, but how do we actually know what type of soil we're working with? Do we need a geologist or something?
Well, you don't need a geologist, but you need that competent person. Remember them. They're the ones who can identify hazards and take care of them.
Right, the confident person, the safety superhero.
Yeah.
So how do they figure out the soil type?
They do visual and manual tests. They look at things like how much moisture is in the soil, how big the particles are, any cracks or anything like that. They might even do some simple tests like the thumb penetration test or the plastic limit test, just to really understand what they're dealing with.
So it's like soil detective work, figuring out how stable it is, how dangerous it could be.
That's it. And once they figure out the soil type, then they got to choose the right protective system.
Yeah.
And that's where 1926.652 gets really specific.
Okay, so let's get into those protective systems. What are the options? I'm guessing there's not just one solution that works for everything, right?
You got it. OSHA outlines different methods, and which one you pick depends on a bunch of things. The soil type, how deep the excavation is there water, are there structures nearby, all that stuff. We're talking sloping, benching, shoring, and shielding.
Okay, so a lot of choices. Let's start with sloping. What does that mean?
Sloping, it's basically cutting back the walls of the excavation at an angle. That way they're less likely to collapse inward. The steeper the slope, the less stable the soil, and the other way around too. OSHA actually gives specific ratios for the slope based on, what type of soil it is.
So you're creating like a little mini mountain inside the excavation. Okay, what about benching? Is that different from sloping?
Kind of similar, but with benching, you make a series of steps, horizontal steps along the walls. Each bench, it helps support the soil above it, so it's less likely to have a full collapse.
Okay, so it's like building a staircase for the soil to lean on. All right, sloping and benching, I get those. Now, what about shoring and shielding? Those sound more, heavy duty.
They are. With shoring, you put in temporary supports like timbers or hydraulic braces. They hold back the excavation walls. They use that a lot in deeper excavations, or if the soil is not very stable.
So it's like giving the soil a big hug to keep it from, caving in. And shielding, is that the same idea?
Similar, but with shielding, you use those pre-made units, trench boxes. They create a barrier between the workers and the walls, and they're built strong. They can handle the pressure from the soil, keep those cave-ins from happening.
Like giant Legos for excavation safety. So with all these options, how does the competent person choose the right one? It seems like a lot to consider.
It is. They got to look at everything, the soil, the depth, the nearby structures, everything. And then they make the call based on what OSHA says and their own experience,
So no easy answers. It's about, using your judgment to keep things as safe as possible.
Exactly. And don't forget, if the excavation is 5 feet deep or more, you almost always need a protective system, even if the soil seems fine.
5 feet doesn't sound that deep. I guess, looks can be deceiving when it comes to soil.
You got it. Even a shallow excavation can be dangerous if you don't have the right protection.
Okay, so soil types and protective systems, check and check. Anything else about sloping and benching that, that we should know? Any details I'm missing?
Well, OSHA, they have very specific rules for the maximum slope you can have for each type of soil, no cutting corners there. And for benching, those benches, they got to be wide enough to support the soil above and give the workers a safe place to stand and work.
So a sturdy staircase for the soil and the workers.
Mm-hmm.
What about those access and egress points, getting in and out of the excavation. Any special rules for those when you're using benching?
Oh, absolutely. OSHA's got rules for where they go and how they're designed to make sure it's safe to get in and out, even with all those different levels.
So always a way in and a way out, no matter what. This is really fascinating stuff.
And we're just skimming the surface here. OSHA 1926.652, it goes into so much detail about support systems, design, inspections, all that. You could do a whole deep dive just on that section.
Okay, I'm starting to see just how much goes into excavation safety. It's not just common sense. It's following all these rules to prevent, really bad things from happening.
That's it, exactly. Worker safety is number one, and OSHA's done a phenomenal job laying out the rules to keep everyone safe.
All right, so much good stuff here, but I'm ready for more. What other excavation safety treasures are hidden in 1926.651?
Let's talk about the competent person. They're like the key player in all this, making sure everything's done right according to OSHA.
Okay, we've mentioned the competent person a few times, but I'm still curious. They're like the unsung heroes of excavation safety.
They really are. We've touched on what they do, but let's really get into it. Who are they? What do they do? All that.
I'm all ears. Tell me everything about these competent people.
Okay, so OSHA, they define a competent person as someone who can, they can spot hazards, things that are dangerous, and they have the power to fix them.
So it's not just someone who's read the OSHA manual. They have to know what they're doing. They got to have experience and be able to make decisions, right there on the spot.
Exactly. They're the ones watching everything, constantly looking for danger and doing something about it right away.
So what kind of things do they actually do? What's their job like?
Oh, it's a lot. They classify the soil. They pick those protective systems we talked about. They inspect them all the time. They check for hazardous atmospheres. They even train the other workers on excavation safety.
So they're like the conductor of the excavation safety orchestra, making sure everything's running smoothly.
I like that. And that's not all. They got to be able to spot changes, if it starts raining suddenly or if they find an underground utility, they got to be able to think fast and adapt.
Sounds like a tough job, but super important. How do you even become a competent person?
Right.
Is there like a certification or a degree or something?
That's a good question. OSHA doesn't have a specific certification, but they do tell you what it takes to be one. Usually it's someone who knows a lot about excavation work, soil mechanics, protective systems, all that. And they just have that sense for safety. They can spot danger before it happens.
So it's education, experience, and a little bit of, intuition.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And they got to keep learning too, stay up to date on all the latest safety stuff.
Okay, so the competent person is in charge, but they can't do everything, right? What about the employer? What's their role?
OSHA's clear about that too. At the end of the day, it's the employer's job to make sure the workplace is safe.
So it's not enough to just, hire a competent person.
Yeah.
It's got to be part of the whole company culture.
Absolutely. The employer sets the example. They got to have safety rules. They got to train people. They got to make sure everyone understands and follows the OSHA rules.
So it's a team effort, right? The employer, the competent person, all the workers, everybody working together to keep the excavation safe.
Exactly. And communication is so important. Everyone's got to talk to each other, about potential hazards, safety concerns, anything like that. It's about being proactive, working together to keep the workplace safe.
Okay, so we've got everybody on the same page working towards safety. Anything else we should be considering?
Let's dig into some of the specific hazards that OSHA 1926.651 talks about. We've mentioned a few, but there are a couple more that are really important.
Okay, let's hear it. What hazards are we talking about?
Falling objects. I mean, it seems obvious, but anything could fall into an excavation. Tools, materials, debris, all that stuff. And that can be really dangerous for the people working down there.
So it's not just about what's under our feet, it's about what's above us too.
Exactly. OSHA, they want you to take precautions, barricades, toe boards, covers, all that.
So you're basically building a wall around the excavation to catch anything that might fall in. How do those things work together?
Well, barricades, those usually go around the perimeter of the excavation, so nobody accidentally falls in. Toe boards, they go along the edge to stop stuff from, rolling or sliding in. And covers, those go over any openings, like manholes or utility vaults, to keep those safe.
So a multi-layered approach to keeping things from falling in.
That's it. And these precautions, they're not just for the workers in the excavation, they're for anyone nearby, too.
Right. So keeping everyone safe. Okay, what about What about mobile equipment? We talked about warning systems before, but what about operating those machines safely around excavations? It seems a little, a little risky to have a big excavator next to a trench.
You're right about that. Those operators, they got to be really good at what they do, be able to maneuver those machines safely. They got to know where the excavation is, stay away from the edge, and be really careful when they're, loading and unloading materials.
It's like a delicate dance,
Yeah.
heavy machinery and a potentially unstable environment.
Exactly. And communication is key. They got to be talking to spotters or using signals to make sure they don't hit anything.
Okay, so it's a team effort to keep those machines from doing any accidental digging. Are there any other hazards, maybe less obvious ones that OSHA talks about?
Yeah, there are. OSHA 1926.651, it also talks about vibrations and unstable ground conditions. You might not be able to see them, like fallen objects or a moving machine, but they can be just as dangerous.
So it's not just about what we can see, it's about those unseen forces that
Right.
can make things unsafe. What kind of vibrations are we talking about here?
Well, they could come from, traffic, construction, even the heavy equipment we just talked about. Those vibrations can actually weaken the soil and make it more likely to cave in.
So it's like a chain reaction. One thing leads to another, and then suddenly you have a dangerous situation.
That's a good way to put it. You got to watch out for any signs of vibration, any changes in the ground, and take precautions. Maybe adjust the protective systems or even stop working altogether.
Okay, so staying vigilant, being aware of what's going on. Now, what about those unstable ground conditions? What makes the ground unstable?
Sometimes it's just, the way the earth is, underground voids or really wet soil. Those can make things unstable. It's like playing Jenga with the earth, but a lot more dangerous.
I like that analogy. So how does OSHA deal with that? Can you even predict when that's going to happen?
Well, it all starts with that competent person. They got to spot those potential hazards when they first check out the site. And then they got to put the right controls in place, maybe do some ground improvement or use special protective systems.
So you're not just, waiting for something bad to happen. You're trying to anticipate it, prevent it before it becomes a problem.
Exactly. That's what real excavation safety is all about. Being proactive, being adaptable, and always thinking ahead.
We've learned a lot about, soil types, protective systems, and all those less obvious hazards. I feel like I have a much better understanding of how complex excavation safety really is.
That's great to hear. And remember, this is just a taste of what OSHA 1926.651 covers. There's so much more in there. Emergency procedures, confined spaces, even using explosives.
Wow, we could do a whole series just on this.
We could. It's a really important topic, that's for sure.
Wow, I'm definitely feeling more informed and ready to advocate for safe excavation practices. I'm really interested to see how all this works, in real life.
That's what we like to hear. Remember, knowledge is power, especially when it comes to safety.
So what's the biggest takeaway you want our listeners to remember from this?
Excavation work, it's always going to be risky, but if we understand and follow OSHA 1926.651, we can make it a lot safer for everyone.
Well said. And remember, Safety One Source is here to help you with all your workplace safety needs.
Absolutely. Now, in part 3, we're going to look at some real-life examples and talk about how to put all these rules into practice on your job sites.
Welcome back. We've been digging deep into OSHA 1926.651, all about excavation safety. We've talked about soil, those protective systems, and a whole bunch of hazards. Now is time to see how this all works in the real world.
You got it. We've got all this knowledge, but now we got to see how it plays out on real job sites, So let's look at some real-life cases. They show just how important these OSHA standards are.
All right, case studies. I'm ready. What kind of situations have you seen where these rules really made a difference?
Okay, let's start with a classic, a trench collapse. Imagine you've got a crew working in a trench, looks stable, no protective systems, and then bam, the walls cave in.
Oh man, that's scary. What happened in that case? Were there any warning signs, or did it just happen?
These things can happen so fast, In this case, one worker, he got partially buried, and another one, he got hurt pretty bad trying to get out. It was a real mess.
Sounds awful. Could they have prevented it, if they had followed those safety rules? What did they find out when they investigated?
Oh yeah, totally. They found out they hadn't checked the soil type properly and there was no shoring or shielding. If they had followed OSHA, this whole thing could have been avoided.
That's a powerful reminder that these rules, they're there for a reason. What other lessons can we learn from these real life situations?
Okay, let's switch gears. Let's talk about hazardous atmospheres. So picture this. Crews working in a deep excavation near a landfill. The air, it's a little funky, but they keep working. And then one of the guys, he just collapses. Methane gas.
Wow. A reminder that some dangers, you can't even see them.
Right. This case, it shows just how important it is to test the air before you go into any excavation, especially near places that could be contaminated.
Yeah, one simple step could save your life. So even if you can't see it or smell it, doesn't mean it's not there.
Exactly. And don't forget ventilation and those respirators. Those are key for dealing with bad air.
Okay, those cases really show that these safety rules, they're not just words, they're real life lessons, you know.
You got it. And by looking at what went wrong, we can try to stop the same things from happening again.
All right, so let's talk about some practical tips. We've covered a lot, but how do we actually make sure these OSHA rules are being followed on the job? What are some things we can do to create a safe work environment?
It starts with commitment, from the top down. Employers, they got to make safety a priority, not just something they have to do. They got to give resources, train people, and create a culture where people feel like they can speak up if they see something unsafe.
So it's about making safety part of everything you do.
Right. And remember, that competent person, they got to have the power to make those safety calls,
So give the experts the tools to do their job. But what about everyone else? The people who aren't the designated competent person. How do we make sure they know how to stay safe?
Training. Every single worker, from the laborers to the supervisors, everyone needs to know about excavation safety, how to spot hazards, what to do in an emergency. They got to understand why these rules exist, not just, what they are.
Knowledge is power. But even if everyone's trained, things can still happen. How important is communication in preventing those close calls from becoming, real disasters?
Communication is huge. You got to encourage people to talk, the workers, the supervisors, the competent person, everybody. Create a system where people feel comfortable, reporting hazards, near misses, even suggesting ways to make things safer.
So it's like everyone's looking out for each other, working together.
Exactly. And don't forget about, keeping records. Write down the soil classifications, the protective systems, the inspections, the training, any incidents, all of it. That way you can show that you're following the rules, and also you can learn from what happened.
Like a safety diary for the whole project.
That's a great way to think about it. And remember, safety, it's not just a one-time thing, it's ongoing. You got to be paying attention, adapting, and learning from mistakes all the time.
Well said. We've really explored a lot in this deep dive, from the basics to real world examples.
Yeah.
I feel like I have a much better grasp of excavation safety now.
I'm glad to hear that. We've just scratched the surface, but hopefully this gives you a good starting point.
Absolutely. And a reminder to everyone, safety. It's not just a job. It's something we all got to be responsible for. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. And until next time, stay safe out there.